All right. Good morning to those joining us from the United States, and good evening to our friends in Asia. Welcome to the United States Institute of Peace, and thank you so much for joining us today for this event. My name is Jennifer Staats, and I'm the Director for East and Southeast Asia programs at USIP. As many of you know, the United States Institute of Peace was founded by Congress in 1984 as a national, independent, nonpartisan institute dedicated to preventing, mitigating, and resolving violent conflict. We do that through our headquarters in Washington, D.C., but also through our field offices around the world. Of course, one of those field offices is in Yangon, and you'll hear more about the terrific work our Myanmar team is doing there in just a few minutes. Today, we are excited to publicly launch two recent USIP publications. The first is entitled Why Burma's Peace Efforts Have Failed to End Its Internal Wars by Bertil Lintner, and the second is called The Arakan Army in Myanmar, Deadly Conflict Rises in Rakhine State by David Mathieson. Both of these reports are available on the USIP website, so if you haven't read them yet, I encourage you to download them at usip.org. The authors of those reports are with us here this morning, along with two leading peace practitioners, Ying Lao and Oo Mutraw, to talk about how Myanmar might potentially reset its efforts to address violence within its borders. And with that, let me say thank you again for joining us, and I will pass things over to USIP's Country Director in Myanmar, Jason Tower.
Thank you, Jennifer, and welcome to all of the participants as well as to our panelists to a really exciting launch event that we have planned here for this morning. As Jennifer said, my name is Jason Tower, and I'm the Country Director for USIP's program based in Yangon. The Myanmar program of the Institute has worked on peace and conflict issues in Myanmar since 2012. It works both through our research on what is really Asia's most complex and longest standing conflict, as well as through supporting peace building initiatives on the ground. The current programming includes a range of different areas. We have programs that support peace education initiatives that are working both with civil society practitioners on the ground to offer trainings to teachers in peace education, as well as more recent work with the state schools in country where we're providing trainings to teachers in those schools, as well as working on avenues for trying to bring peace education into the national curriculum. There's other aspects of the programming that look at the relationship between investment and conflict. So again, insofar as cross-border investment is a key factor that drives conflict in country, we're trying to better understand how investment plays a role with respect to conflict dynamics. And we've published actually quite a few reports on these topics over the past couple of years. A very recent report in July looks at actually illicit investments and the way in which illicit investments, particularly in casino cities and in other forms of investments that are set up to host criminal activities, are undermining efforts to address peace, particularly in Karen State. We have other aspects of our programming that work on security sector, particularly around community security. And that programming has been quite active around the recent elections that were held in November, where we supported dialogue as well as training for security sector stakeholders around election security, with an eye towards trying to take steps to help prevent election violence around the 2020 elections that were just held. And then, of course, we're also sponsoring and commissioning and doing a lot of our own internal research on really a lot of the dynamics that are driving the very complex conflict that you'll be hearing a lot more about here today. And really excited to be able to launch what I think are two really phenomenal studies here this morning. Jennifer's already given a brief introduction to each of the two studies. Just wanting to say a couple of words about both why these two studies, as well as about the format for our panel here today. think the two studies actually complement one another very well. The first of the studies by Bertil Lintner looks at really why the country's peace process has failed to make progress over the past few years, at least the current iteration of the peace process. And then it looks deep into history to understand what lessons might be learned by looking at some of the previous failed efforts to try to make peace in country. So this first paper looks for new paths forward for the country's peace process by deeply exploring its history, and I think also identifying in course of doing so a lot of the reasons why the peace process hasn't been able to achieve peace. And then, of course, the second paper by David Mathieson focuses in on the most deadly of the current conflicts in Rakhine State between the Arakan Army and the Myanmar military, which also is, I think, one of the least understood of Myanmar's current conflicts. Of course, the reasons why the conflict has become so intense in Rakhine State, a lot of that relates to, I think, some of the issues that were raised in the first of these papers around the failures of the peace process. But I think really together, the two papers do a fantastic job of both explaining where some of the shortfalls are, as well as explaining some of the important conflict dynamics that are there, which I think are really critical as we think about the post-elections period and the new government that will be coming in to follow. So with that, just a few words about our format here this morning. Each of the authors will take roughly 6 to 7 minutes to introduce some of the main points and arguments in their respective works, touching also on other issues around both Rakhine State and around aspects of ways in which Myanmar might find new approaches to building peace looking forward. And then we have also two very well-known practitioners who will be offering some additional insights into the two studies and into the themes that are explored in the two studies. So with that, I have the honor first of introducing the first of our speakers here this morning. The first speaker will be David Scott Mathieson, who is a Myanmar-based analyst working on conflict, peace, humanitarian and human rights issues. He was previously a senior researcher at Human Rights Watch, based in both Thailand and in Myanmar, and he contributes regular articles to publications like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and many other publications. This is actually the second report that David has authored for USIP. So it was wonderful to have a second opportunity for the Institute to work with David in the production of this report. So David, over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Jason, and thank you everyone for joining, and to the team at USIP for great support over the past several months in completing this report. I just want to offer three very specific observations, both about the report but about the general peace process and ways forward for peace and stability in Rakhine State. The first one is the rise of the Arakan Army is probably one of the most deadly insurgencies that Myanmar has seen for quite some time. Being formed 11 years ago in Kachin State, up in the north, the Arakan Army has drawn on a very deep well, I think, of long-standing grievances by the ethnic Arakanese Rakhine community in Rakhine State, and has slowly pursued a very classical but also very innovative form of insurgent mobilization by training up in the north and then slowly moving troops down, and really engaging the Myanmar military, the Tatmadaw, in the central townships, the central plains of Rakhine State, especially over the past 3 years. And what we've seen over the past 3 years is really a sustained level of conflict that has deeply impacted on the civilian population. Something like 220,000 or so, mostly ethnic Arakanese, Rakhine people have been displaced due to that conflict. There have been reported more than 300 civilian casualties, mostly by the Tatmadaw, using heavy air power, heavy artillery, using arson, using the kind of tactics that we've seen in many other places around Myanmar over the past 70 years against many other ethnic minorities. It's this standard, really quite brutal toolkit of pacification and counterinsurgency that the Tatmadaw pursues. And I think that has helped to kind of bridge both long-standing historical grievances on the part of the Rakhine community that has driven support for the Arakan Army, but also driven new avenues of support through these abuses against the civilian population. Secondly, why has this insurgency been so sustained and so damaging? Just at a time, it coincided with the growth of the nationwide peace process and the signing of the not exactly nationwide ceasefire agreement in 2005. And I think the AA insurgency and the violence that we've seen over the past 5 years in Rakhine State, first against the Rohingya population, of course, in 2016 and 2017, but then a war basically against the Rakhine population as well, I think really stands as a rebuke to the efficacy of the nationwide ceasefire process. And the fact that you have a very long-standing, older Rakhine armed group, the Arakan Liberation Party, Arakan Liberation Army, who are one of the signatories to the NCA and sit around the peace table talking about peace, while a younger, more aggressive insurgency has raged over the past few years, I think really points to deep failings in the way that the government, the military, and also international support has been directed at seeking peace in Myanmar. And I think that, one of the major points is that when you ignore these long-standing grievances from ethnic nationalities around the country, you get insurgencies like this. When you ignore genuine concerns and the lack of political and social and economic results, I think you get insurgencies like the AA, and I think that there are broader lessons to be taken from that, and looking around the rest of the country. I mean, I'll leave it to other colleagues to talk directly about the NCA and other peace processes. But to me, the Arakan Army really is, and then this conflict in Rakhine, really is one of the main stumbling blocks to a sustainable nationwide peace. That and many other groups that are excluded from the process. And then the third point I want to make is that I know that in Washington and many other capitals around the world, the plight of the Rohingya Muslim population has loomed, quite rightly, loomed very large in people's perceptions of what's going on in Rakhine State. And unfortunately, I don't see any positive resolution of the Rohingya crisis and the return of nearly 1 million refugees from Bangladesh, unless you start looking at connecting the Arakan Army insurgency and broader peace and the rights of the Rohingya. And I think that's something that policymakers around the world need to start understanding better and start connecting nationwide ceasefire processes with regional conflicts such as the AA, and then connecting it also with the rights of the Rohingya, and kind of seeing all of these complex connections, and seeing that many communities are actually suffering in places like Rakhine, and partly due to this lack of understanding of how complex things are. And so hopefully more understanding of the AA insurgency and the grievances of many different communities in Rakhine State will start hopefully kind of signposting directions for a reorientation of the nationwide ceasefire process and the peace process writ large. So I'll conclude there and hand it over to other colleagues.
Thank you for that, David. That both got into a lot of the key points in the report, as well as offering some of the key suggestions for the international community and for those who are working around the peace process and around issues in Rakhine more broadly. Next, would like to introduce Oo Mutraw, who will be giving some remarks related to both the paper and to David's presentation here this morning. Mayu co-founded the Going Home Where We Belong program back in 2007, and has worked with Karen and Karenni refugees for many years. She has experiences as an educator, working in conflict zones, particularly in Rakhine State, as also designed programming as well as courses on governance, public policy related issues, democracy, and human rights, and has provided a lot of technical support and guidance, especially to the Karen National Union around both the peace process as well as around some of those other governance related issues. So with that, I'd like to hand the floor over to Mayo for some brief remarks. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason. A few observations from the two reports. First of all, both are excellent reports. I'm sure many other newcomers and learners of the process and the situation will appreciate the reports very much. First on the David's report. I think it's important to look at to analyze the Burmese the conflicts in Myanmar, taking the holistic approach. Because if we look at only Rakhine, it looks deadly, but it is deadly, but it is not the only deadly conflict in the country. So I think if we are going to link that conflict in Rakhine and with the peace process, we would have to take the holistic approach, the overall the country, other conflicts in other area. And I also think that there is a danger in not taking holistic approach to analyzing the conflict, because we might unintentionally be marginalizing other stakeholders, even within that particular state that we are talking about. Because it's not, I think it's a little bit of oversimplification to say that the conflict is between AA and Tatmadaw, because it's more than that, right? And I also think that AA is the latest newcomer to the conflict in that state, although probably it is the strongest force to reckon with by far. But singling out AA also places undue burden on the group, I think, and it's not also inclusive. And if we are going to find solution, we would have to find a solution that all inhabitants in the state can accept. So I think we would like to avoid being not inclusive. I think also characterizing conflict, and it's important, the conflict analysis, I think conflict analysis is important to characterize conflict, either conflict in Rakhine or elsewhere in the country, for the reason that peace process exists. I think to say that it's grievances, it implies something negative, I think. I think we might also want to say, look at the cause, and then the effect is the grievance. So if we look at the cause and effect, if we look at it from that perspective, then we might be able to appreciate why we are stuck, for example, in the peace process, right? The ongoing peace process now not getting anywhere or not producing any meaningful outcome. So those are a few observations. Otherwise, I think there are some very valuable informations that many of us can appreciate. So with that view, I can come to agree with Mr. Lintner's the conclusion that the holistic view is important, and also responding to Rakhine. We would have to bring Rakhine, AA, or any party involved in Arakan State, to bring them into peace process. We would probably have to start from the fresh, to looking at the conflict as a whole, the country as a whole. I think it's vital for peace that the ethnic and religious diversity, because the diversity is not only in the country as a whole, but within the Rakhine State, we can appreciate the diversity in the Rakhine State as well. So those holistic approach to the peace process must also involve the unarmed, which I agree with Mr. Lintner, that ethnic groups, such as ethnic political parties, religious institutions, women's groups, youth groups, and other civil societies. So I think if we can foster that, we might find some hope for the ongoing process to be able to produce a meaningful outcome. Otherwise, we have witnessed a process that is not taking us to anywhere that we originally intended to, or at least we anticipated to get or to see. Last, but I think most important, we must keep demanding the political will from all actors, and particularly from the two powers, the two power groups, the government and the Tatmadaw. I think pretty much it's in their hands to, if they are politically very committed, if they really like to move forward in the peace process, they can. This is not rocket science. So I think we have to keep demanding the political will, especially from the power groups. So for now, that's my observation. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Meo, and I think that's also a very good segue into the second report that we're launching here this morning. Just before I introduce Bertil Lintner, I just wanted to let all participants know that if you have questions that you'd like to raise to any of the members of the panel or to the whole of the panel, you have two ways of doing so. One is you're able to use the hashtag @USIP Rakhine and go ahead and submit your questions through Twitter, or you could go to the USIP event webpage, and there's a place there to submit your questions. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce the author of the second study being launched here this morning. Bertil Lintner has covered Burma's civil wars and related issues such as Burmese politics and the Golden Triangle, the drug trade for nearly 40 years. He was previously a correspondent for the Far Eastern Economic Review from 1982 to 2004. And he now writes regularly for the Asia Times, as well as being the author of many books about Burma's civil war and ethnic strife. So Bertil, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, yes. Well, when President Thein Sein, or then President Thein Sein, launched his peace process in 2012, we had to realize this was 8 years ago, right? I was often asked by non-Burmese that, what do you think about the peace process? My answer, or my counter question, was always, what do you think makes this peace process different from previous ones? And I found to my surprise that nearly all of them, or I would say all of them, were unaware of the fact that this was not the first time any attempt had been made to end decades of civil war. In fact, it was the sixth time in modern Burmese history. The only difference I could see this time was that the involvement of foreign actors. and foreign money. This is something completely new. And that was why I decided to write this report. I wanted to describe and analyze what happened in the 1950s, with the peace parley in 1963, talks in the 1970s, the general amnesty in 1980, and then a series of ceasefire agreements which were agreed upon but not signed in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and see what kind of lessons could possibly be learned from those failed attempts to establish peace. And my report is also a critical look at the present peace process and the so-called nationwide ceasefire agreement that the ethnic armed organizations are supposed to sign before any meaningful political discussion or dialogue can be held. This, I've always argued, is like putting the cart before the horse, and it's not going to work. The other problem with the NCA, the National Ceasefire Agreement, is the signatories themselves. To date, about 10 groups, or to be precise, 10 groups, have signed this, what they call an NCA, but most of them are very small, they're tiny, of little relevance. Actually, a Burmese friend of mine once said that if anyone would like to disarm those groups, someone would have to give them some guns first. It's not entirely a joke, because that is actually what has happened. Some groups which were absolutely nothing, had nothing before they signed the NCA, now have camps, soldiers' uniforms, and even guns. In fact, if you look at those 10 groups, it's only 2 that actually have any army of any significance. That's the Karen National Union and the Restoration Council of Shan State, maybe to some extent the New Mon State Party as well. But the other groups are basically irrelevant. And EAOs actually prefer to call them NGAs, I mean non-governmental armies, representing more than 80% of all non-governmental combatants in Myanmar, have not signed the NCA, and they are unlikely to do so. So how can this statement be broken? And that is what I want to try to address in my report. And my recommendation is to scrap the so-called NCA, which only serves to divide the ethnic armed organizations into so-called signatories and so-called non-signatories. But in any peace process anywhere in the world, normally the government or the central authorities would announce a ceasefire, an unconditional ceasefire. The armed resistance groups or group would respond, talks would be held, a consensus may be reached, and then a political agreement could be signed to end a certain conflict. That is not the case in Myanmar. If we look at the nature of the NCA, and especially the way that Tatmadaw is interpreting the meaning of the NCA, is actually nothing short of surrender. That makes the present peace process not that different at all from what happened in the past. Because that has always been the main problem, the lack of will to compromise, the lack of will to listen to the causes and the grievances of the various armed actors, if you want to call them that, why they took up arms in the first place and what they're fighting for, and how we can find a solution that would satisfy everybody concerned, if there is such a solution at all. And my recommendation is also that all these foreign entities, which have invested millions of dollars into the peace process, really have to rethink the strategies and look at the situation more realistically. They cannot go on pretending that there is a process involving 10 armed groups and 8 groups have not signed. That is not the way forward. It is not helping us find any solution. So, and by all this money that's being poured into the so-called signatories, I would also argue that they're corrupting the whole process. It's become an industry, and that is not good at all. That is very dangerous and it's destructive. And then, of course, what we have to do is to try to encourage and get everybody involved to engage in a real and genuine dialogue about the future of the country. What kind of country should Myanmar be? That has been the problem since independence in 1948. Should it be a centrally controlled state with a very strong government, limited powers to the outlying areas? Or should it be a federal union of basically not quite autonomous, but self-governing states and other entities. That is the issue that has to be addressed. That issue has to be addressed now, not after signing some kind of NCA. But I see this, it may sound very unrealistic, it may not happen, but nevertheless, as I see it, it's the only viable way forward if we are ever going to bring decades of civil war to an end. Thank you. That's what I have to say.
Thank you very much for that, Bertil. In the interest of time, I'll go ahead and introduce the fourth of our speakers, certainly not the least. Ying Lao will be our final speaker on the panel. Ying Lao serves as the Deputy Director at the Selaween Institute. She was born and raised in Shan State and has extensive experience working around civic engagement as well as on human rights campaigns. She was a member of the Federal Constitution Drafting and Coordinating Committee and has also been a representative of the Shan Women's Action Network and Women's League of Burma. Ying Lao, over to you. You have around 5 to 6 minutes.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks, USIP, for organizing the event, and thank you for inviting me. And it is an honor to be speaking to all of you together with you, Bertil, and David. Please allow me to address the elephant in the room. I'd like to acknowledge that none of us speaking at this event here are from Rakhine State. And there is no way for any of us to truly know and understand the suffering and hardship that the people of Rakhine State face every single day over there. And it would have been really nice to have some of our Rakhine brothers and sisters to be here with us. I will talk about two issues. I would say they are extremely important issues, but with the least power. They are political parties and CBO-CSO. We cannot talk about political parties without talking about the recent elections. There are four main concerns that I have regarding to the recent 2020 general elections. The first one is elections irregularities. There have been reports on irregularities during the elections, particularly in Chin State and in Shan State. Many of them have not been resolved. And in addition to that, 1 month after the elections, we still don't know how many people were eligible to vote. 36 million or 37 million, it's still not clear. The lack of transparency in voter lists and all of this thing. Then in addition to that, when we look at the media coverage, all the media coverage had undermined the role of non-Burma dominant party. They only report NLD versus USDP, all the vote results, everything, all the bar, all the graph, all the charts represent NLD and USDP and never really about ethnic political parties or any other non-Burma dominant parties. Similar patterns can be found with reports and coverage from NGOs and observers as well. And all of these are paving the way for a centralized party, one-party system in the country. And in the interest of multi-party democracy, it is very important that we do not undermine the role of opposition parties. None or very few, if any, of these are being reported. And if the role were reversed, would we be silenced about all of this? Made me wonder if we really stand for democracy or we stand for NLD. And it may have been one and the same, but it is no longer the case. The next issue is about the CBO-CSO. We know that the oppressed tends to become oppressors, and we shouldn't be surprised, and instead we should be expecting it. And because power corrupt and absolute power corrupt absolutely, and we should prepare for it. CBO-CSO are what will keep governments in check and are a pillar for a strong democracy. However, we are seeing a lot of growing numbers of arrests of student activists. Just this morning, 3 Rakhine youth were arrested for organizing a motorbike campaign to raise awareness about International Human Rights Day. During the elections, thousands campaigned for political parties, violated all sorts of guidelines from the Ministry of Health, but no arrests were made. But students who were protesting to end war in Rakhine State and got arrested for endangering the public. Narrowing space for media as well as CBO, CSO. Also, there are a lot of examples of those and incidents of those. Before I run out of time, I'd like to head back to the peace process itself. The purpose of peace building is not to end not just simply end the civil war, but to also build sustainable peace. The current peace design is so flawed and miscalculated that not only that it will not bring sustainable peace, it has not even been able to end the war, any war. Just today, more than 200 villagers in Namtu Township in northern Shan State were forced to leave their home due to increased fighting and military activities in the area. Close to 5,000 IDPs leading toward the elections in Taumei Township. The role of political parties has been very limited in the peace process. Most of the negotiations are between the military or the government and the EOs. And parties have very little say. Every time they try to propose anything alternative to whatever the two groups are saying, they always get the response that, oh, the other two already agree on this issue. We are not open for discussion anymore. It is disappointing to see international institutions that take pride in its value for democracy and peace to embrace the process that undermine the role of democratic institutions like political parties and CSO. Under the current process, I have a better chance of making my voice heard as an armed force than being a political party or CBO or CSO. Not that being heard will bring anything meaningful. To build peace, to make peace possible, we must address the root cause of the problem. That is the failure of the state to ensure equality among all people and the right of self-determination for all member states that form this country. Judging from the 60 or so agreements that they have reached in the Union Accord, Part 1, 2, and 3, the essence of federalism, equality, and the actual rights to self-determination is nowhere to be seen. I consulted with some of my mentors on what I plan to say this evening. They warned me to tone down a little bit because I could be considered as peace spoiler for saying all I have just said. I told them that it is the risk I'm willing to take because this is my country and all my family and relatives live here. Possibility of sustainable peace and stability through the establishment of Federal Democratic Union isn't just a job for me. It isn't just a subject to learn and to become an expert in. It is the life and death issues, and I have the duty to the people of this country to speak the truth, to speak my truth. And thank you for your attention. I probably have been a little bit over time. Thank you.
Thank you. I think some very inspiring remarks from Ying Lao. I appreciate that. Would like to transition now into the discussion part of the panel. Just a reminder to participants, you can send questions in. We've received quite a few questions already, but you can send questions in either through the events page or via Twitter. I'd like to kind of kick off the discussion, really pulling a couple of the threads together, both around some of the disappointments with respect to elections outcomes that Ying Lao mentioned, as well as the point that Mayo mentioned around political will. And I guess the question to put out to the panel for each of the panelists maybe to consider briefly is, do we see anything changing in the post-elections period when it comes to either political will of the parties to the conflict, to trying to find a new way to address some of these issues? And do we also see there being any possibility, particularly in the places where elections were canceled, for the different stakeholders to come together and to make elections now happen in the time remaining before the new government is seated?
Yeah, can I answer that question? I think it's very easy. No. Just more of the same. I haven't seen any initiatives worth even considering or thinking about. The Tatmadaw hasn't changed its attitude. The government has not changed its attitude. It talks about a national unity government, but still, It's a very early stage. So what is that going to mean in the end anyway? But we also have to remember that we're talking about the government and the power. The government that takes over sometime next year is not really to be in power, because real power, actual power, remains with the military through the control of the three most important ministries: defense, the home ministry, which is internal security, and then border affairs. That leaves very little to the elected government, whoever is there. Then, of course, an attempt to change this arrangement is impossible, because more than 75% of all the MPs have to vote in favor of such a change, and the military controls 25%. So I think we're basically stuck here. And the way forward is probably what Ying Lao is saying here, that the real opposition now, from now on, will not be in the parliament, it will not be the political parties, it will be the CSOs, who are organizing people on the grassroots level. And they have a very important role to play. And they, I think, will become the real opposition in the years to come.
I wanted to see if there were any comments from other members of the panel on those questions. Okay, so I'm going to shift now to some of the questions from the audience. Some of them will be directed to specific members of the panel. And I see that we have a question here in particular for David. David, do you see how do you see the specific impacts of counterterrorism laws as mentioned in your report? Are these laws having any impact on humanitarian support that's coming into the country? In other words, do you see the civilian population being unable to receive aid because of that terrorism designation?
Just quickly on that, I think that limitations on humanitarian assistance in Rakhine and many other places, in Kachin and Northern Shan and lots of other places, has been long-standing before the counterterrorism law was passed in 2014, and before two armed groups, the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army and the Arakan Army, were designated formally. I think the abuses of the CT law are really against perceived supporters of the Arakan Army. And picking up civilians and charging them under provisions of the counterterrorism law, and that's really worrying. But I think repression of civil society throughout the country, there's a huge legal tool bag that authorities use all the time, as Ying Lao mentioned just this morning, against 3 student activists. So they can pick and choose whatever law that they want to actually go after people. And I think that there's a concern that perhaps that CT law could potentially be expanded around to other parts of the country. But I think a lot of long-standing activists and supporters in civil society, political parties, and many others are just as worried about the Unlawful Associations Act and many others. And I think the real way forward is for the government to actually repeal or amend all of these laws. There was high expectations they would do so 5 years ago, and they've made very little progress on that. And that's something that I think, as Ying Lao was saying, and Bertil supported that civil society really should be the ones to push this. But I also think that international donors should be pushing the government to do the same thing. And actually showing far more support for civil society, and definitely speaking out against the misuse of counterterrorism laws. And pushing hard on diminishing humanitarian space for not just internationals, and there's a kind of a conversation about this in Rakhine and many others, that it's about limitations on foreigners having access. The most important thing is actually local aid workers and local people getting access, because they're the ones doing a lot of the really hard work in a lot of conflict areas.
Thank you, David. There's a question here for Ying Lao and Mayo that I'll raise next. So I think both of you had talked to some extent about civil society exclusion from the peace process, and as the participant raises, how can the international community best support civil society to advocate for a more sustainable peace process? Are there suggestions you would have for members of the international community?
I think I go first. I think short. I would just say really, really shortly. Just don't be a hypocrite. Basically, democracy and NLD are no longer the same thing. That is really clear. You can look at every single indicator in the country. The arrest of the journalists, the arrest of all the activists, every single thing, you can look at it. So basically, are we for NLD or are we for democracy? If we are for democracy, then we're going to have to step up our game. That would be the first thing. But I also like to add a few things on the limitations on CBO/CSO. It's not just the counter-terrorism issues. For example, the anti-money laundering law and financial and banking regulations, all of these things are making it a lot harder for CBO/CSO to access their fund. CBO/CSO are not required to register. However, in order to have a bank account, you need to be a registered organization. Without that, you cannot accept a certain amount of money from foreign countries or things like that. And then even if you actually try to comply with after you registered and you have all the documents necessary, all the bank account, it is still extremely difficult for CSOs, CBOs to access funding. It took my organization 6 months to access a small amount of funding. And my organizations, we know a lot of regulations and we know 4 languages. I myself know 4 languages. But many small CSO, they have very limited, understanding of knowledge and all of this thing on regulations or laws. They have very little dealing with banking, language issue, barriers, all sorts of barriers. And with this kind of, sometime in order to limit CSO, you don't really have to attack them directly. If you attack their source of funding, that's how you stop them. And it is really difficult to see and to identify. And that is what is happening in the country right now. It has been going on for the past 2-3 years.
Thank you, Ying Lao. Meo, did you want to add anything?
No, I think Ying Lao said it all. I'll pass.
Great. So we have another question. So given that the formal peace process has not made any progress, as has been discussed, would looking at more specific issues, such as how to move forward with economic reforms, be a possible way to start addressing some of the grievances? And if so, how potentially could different stakeholders begin to do that? And that's a general question to the panel.
David?
Go ahead, Bertil.
Well, I mean, I think I would just like to emphasize what Ying Lao said, that we're not just talking about establishing peace in the sense that fighting will stop. What we're looking for is sustainable peace. And sustainable peace, it means a political solution to the problems that have been troubling the country since independence. And that has to do with what I mentioned earlier, what kind of country it should be. But then if you come into economic development, well, it doesn't mean that much as long as everything is centrally controlled, where there's very little power to the outlying states and the regions, as they're called now. So I don't think economic development alone can solve the problem. On the contrary, it can even make things worse. But look at what's happening in Rakhine State, for instance. There's been a lot of economic development in the Pakan Jain mines, the hydroelectric power development and so on. One outcome of that is, of course, that the ethnic Kachins have been reduced to minority in their own state because of the influx of outside workers, of outside capital and outside experts. It's only one of these problems which comes with economic development. So I think where we have to start is really to get down and talk about a political solution. Without that, I can't see the country move forward economically, politically, or socially.
Thank you, Bertil. I wanted to see if any of other panelists would like to raise any points on that question.
I will say briefly. I think to achieve the sustainable peace, generally and probably, but then most importantly, it's the political will of all actors who are engaging in these negotiations, right? And who have yet to engage in the negotiations. But for the international community, one thing recently happened. For example, somebody from Korean community has been awarded the Goldman Environmental Award. I think this is something that international organizations, international community can look critically into and acknowledge, recognize that. And this kind of activities, the Goldman Award has been awarded to an individual, the leader of the organization, who has been working on preserving the environment, protecting the cultures and the forest. And I think this kind of activities in particular, for speaking for the Korean people, this is, if you look at it from the peace building perspective, this is very much about trust building on one hand. On the other hand, this is the exercise of right to self-determination, that people can manage their own affairs. I think this kind of recognition, more recognition should come. And then we will see, okay, it makes sense. These people are demanding for the right to self-determination because they can do that. And this recognition, this confidence will actually encourage all partners in the dialogue to see, to acknowledge each other, to recognize each other. And I think that's how we can probably move forward. As long as we fail to recognize, we will help you, we will help you manage, we will do this for you, as if all other peoples are incapable of or do not have the capacity. I think that's counterproductive. So we need to look into activities that have been going on, that are already in place, and acknowledge that, recognize that, and perhaps if these activities in our understanding are strengthening trust building of any kind in this peace building process, then we might also want to contribute more into that, to encourage that.
Thank you, Meo. I want to go ahead and take another question here. So this question, I think, is directed to Bertil, but I think that the whole panel may also want to add additional points to it. But the question is, how do you see the relationship between the illicit economy and the peace process? And do you see the involvement of militias in the illicit economy as being an obstacle to addressing conflict?
That's a very good question, because there's one actor we haven't talked about at all here, the PTZ, the local militias. And there are hundreds of them all over the country. These are people with guns. They're not necessarily fighting for any ideal or any political agenda or anything like that. They are involved in business. And they are dealing in all sorts of things, and including drugs. And they're doing so with the blessing of the authorities, because they're supposed to be maintaining law and order in the respective areas. But because there's no money in the Sunday coffer to pay for them, they have to find their own ways out of it. So yes, there is definitely a link between people involved in armed groups and the illicit economy. And actually, something happened today which I found actually amazing, that a well-known gangster from Macau, his nickname was Wagner Koi. It means the broken tooth Koi, because he had a broken tooth. He was leader of the 14K trial in Macau, spent many years in prison, was released in 2012, and now he's back in business, investing in Chuecoco, this new very strange economic zone in Rakhine State. Here you have a person with a criminal record and with criminal connections, not only inside the country, but it goes to Hong Kong, to Macau, even to the Republic of Belau in the Pacific Ocean. Actually, the U.S. Justice Department has blacklisted him today and designated him as a target. So these are the kind of people who are also involved in making things more difficult, much harder to find a political solution to Myanmar's problems. Because these people are not interested in a political solution, because they will then have to go away and lose their very lucrative businesses.
Thank you, Bertil. Any other points from the panel on that question, or shall I go to another question? Okay, I think we have time for one more before we have to start wrapping up here. I think we can take one more question here for David. David, you have a question here about Burma control over the economy in Rakhine State, and how much Burma control over the economy in Rakhine State is a driver of conflict there. How potentially could that sort of issue be addressed?
That's a great question. It's very complicated. I think that the Tatmadaw operates in Rakhine State the way it operates in almost every other part of the country. Massive land grabs, big military bases that don't have many soldiers on them, because they're basically seizing land. And I think we've got a balance, and it's very similar to lots of other parts of the country, where you've got kind of local economic interests on the part of the Tatmadaw, but then you've got big corporate interests in either through the holding companies, UME and others, and then private business. Basically the Tatmadaw operates on two logics, and one is pacification and the other is commerce. And so I think Rakhine is no different from that. But actually unpacking all the details of that would take a very long time. So great question, but you've kind of opened Pandora's box there. But one thing just to add to some of the previous questions and what the other panelists were saying. And Norma Oo's point is really good to talk about Paul Saint-Ouen and winning this award. I think this new NLD government is going to be even more emboldened than the previous administration to pursue a very heavy development approach and using the World Bank and the UN Development Program, Chinese investment coming in, and anyone who's using development as some kind of peace building tool, I think will just drive further instability. And will make the resolution of the conflict even more difficult. So as Ying Lao was saying, this very liberal NLD government wants to build big roads and big industrial parks, and that's not necessarily what the people want. And I think the Salween Peace Park is one major kind of pushback against that. And so making a development project moving forward that's integrated into the peace process in some way. A lot of international interlocutors love to use this term conflict sensitivity. Well, there's no sensitivity to it. And in fact, a lot of the approaches that they're pushing, looking at Karen State and this proposed World Bank project of something like $250 million called Peaceful and Prosperous Communities, will probably result in the exact opposite. And so I think that's really something to watch, that anyone that looks for economic solutions as opposed to political solutions to the peace process is just going to drive further conflict, in my view.
Thank you for that, David. We are running up on the hour here. I wanted to give each of the other three participants a chance to just pull out any other threads or to respond to anything else that has been raised, either through some of the questions or through some of the comments that were given to the two reports. So Bertil, why don't you go first, Ying Lao, and then Mayo. Oh, you need to unmute, Bertil, sorry.
Sorry. I've got nothing more to add than that we have to look for a political solution to the conflict, not just the people start shooting at each other. That's not a solution. And we have to recognize that this is a country with an immense ethnic and religious diversity. We cannot say that 135 national races and everybody's in Myanmar. It doesn't work that way, and nobody would accept that. And this is the issue that has to be discussed, and it should be discussed now, not after signing a better meaningless so-called nationwide ceasefire agreement.
So I like to come back to the questions about what should international community do to help with all these things. Recent experience with elections and irregularities, and how international community have been very hesitant to point out all of these things that really frustrate me. Because if the role were reversed, they may not be silenced. That's really back the questions of whether the international community really, really want to promote democracy, or just something imaginary that may have represented democracy. So this is why, I said something about don't be a hypocrite. But on the constructive notes, I wanted to see international community ideally should be working itself out of work, out of job. International community shouldn't be too proud to be claiming that we have been in this country for 20 years, for 30 years, for 50 years. That means you didn't do your job. If international community really did their job, and there would be no need for international community in this country. That would be the ideal situation. In reality, how would that work? How would that work is we really need to invest in CBO-CSO. We really, really need to be investing in national institutions, policy institute, policy, all the national institutions, local institutions, promoting all of the national experts, the native of Myanmar who are international experts. And even the terms that we use are extremely, extremely discriminatory. International expert, national expert. So the foreigner are considered as international expert, like expert in every country, and then national expert, even though they have international degree and have all this education, but still considered as national expert. How are they different? It's not clear. All of these things really, really perpetuate the problem, really, really undermine the role of CBO-CSO and national organization. And we really need to change all of these practices to help maintain and strengthen all these international, all these national organizations. In addition to that, at the same time, for international communities, it is really also important that we use the terms, instead of saying empowering and capacity building, how about saying enabling? Enable the national organization. They do not need empowering. They know what the problem is. They know what the solutions are. You just need to enable them. You don't need to empower them. That whole idea of empowering and capacity building and providing technical support and all of these things are also very patronizing concept. And that's really, really put CBO-CSO and national organization in a dependent role. I am becoming really, really negative. I'm going to conclude my points. So it was supposed to be a constructive points. So these are some of the things that I really hope we see from the international organizations. And then another point, another issue is to really, conduct some sort of review or some sort of funding audit within the international organization, how much funding they have provided to international organizations versus national organizations. Because we have a number of organizations who claim to have funded, 80%, 85% of their partners are national organizations. So that means 15% of them are international. I wonder what the budget amount is. Those kind of practices really, really need to be addressed. These are what will make the CBO-CSO in the country strong, and this is how we strengthen democracy in the country, and this is how we promote the universal human rights and equality and all of this that we hold near and dear to ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Ying Lao. And Mayo, any final comments?
Thank you. One one specific comment I would like to make regarding the David's, especially on David's report. I think David suggested that we bring AA into the national peace process because exclusion does not help solve the problem. Generally, it's true, but particularly on this point, I think we must win AA's heart to desire to be a part of the national process. For that, there are a couple of demands that AA has made for now. One is regarding the by-elections for the townships that elections were cancelled, recent elections were cancelled. And the other one is the bilateral deal that they are engaging. And as we know, yesterday they had a meeting, AA had a meeting with the Tatmadaw representative. There was no government representative, and Tatmadaw representative also was not the ones that Tatmadaw designated to be a part of, to lead the negotiations with the armed organizations. So we really do not know what's going on, but I think it's important we pay, as observer of the peace process in Myanmar, we need to pay attention to AA's demand, in part because it shows that AA, like other EAOs, are not confining themselves to military solution only. They are looking for a political solution as well, and they make political demands. And I think if we are to solve the political problems in this country, if we are to help solve the problems, if we are to help bring about peace, I think we need to listen to those demands. And last, I would like to reiterate, we have to honestly question the political will of the people who hold the power to make a change. The war, to end the war, to bring peace. To end the war, for the rest of the country, we get poorer and poorer. But because of the war, we know a handful of people and institutions getting stronger, a handful of people getting richer. Do we really want to end the war? I think that political will has to be constantly questioned if we are to make a change in the process that is not being productive. And we have to constantly raise that political question so that for us to be able to probably expect or anticipate a change in the process that we are engaging, or many of us are observing. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'd just like to close by thanking all four of our panelists, and particularly the two authors of the new studies. For our participants, thank you also for joining this morning, and do note that both of the reports are now available on our website. There are Burmese versions of the reports available, so if you'd like to get access to a Burmese version, please do reach out, and we can make sure that you're able to get access to that. So again, thanks to all of our panelists and to everyone for joining, and look also for many more USIP events, both more broadly on peace and conflict related issues, as well as specific to Myanmar. Thank you.
Thank you.